On the morning of May 11th, 1905, a farmer named Elias was walking the perimeter of his wheat field. He was 40 miles outside the town of Snyder, in the Oklahoma Territory. It was a quiet morning. The air was cool. The sky was a bruised, innocent blue. But then, Elias stopped. Sitting in the middle of his field, half buried in the mud, was a grand piano. He didn't own a piano. None of his neighbors owned a piano. This object, this massive, 1,000-pound instrument of iron and mahogany, was sitting there as if it had fallen from the stars. The keys were stripped. The wood was splintered. But it was unmistakably a piano. Elias didn't know it yet, but that piano belonged to a house that no longer existed, in a town that had just been erased from the map. In 1905, meteorology was barely a science. It was a guessing game. There was no radar, no sirens, no National Weather Service alerts screaming from a cell phone. There was only the horizon. And on the night of May 10th, that horizon birthed a monster. A storm so violent, so physically impossible, that modern meteorologists look at the damage records and call it a problematic F5. Problematic. Because physics says wind shouldn't be able to do what this storm did. This is the story of the Snyder tornado. The night, the sky turned green, and the earth began to grind its teeth. To understand why the tragedy was so absolute, you have to understand the trap. And the trap was Snyder itself. In 1905, Snyder wasn't just a town, it was a promise. We are in the era of the final frontier, the Oklahoma Territory. This is the tail end of the Wild West, transitioning violently into the age of agriculture and industry. The pistol was being traded for the plow. Snyder was a boomtown, nestled in Kiowa County. It was young, scrappy, hungry. It had only been founded a few years prior, springing up from the dust like a miracle after the land lotteries opened the territory to white settlement. If you stood on Main Street in early May of 1905, you would hear the sound of hammers, constant, rhythmic, optimism. New storefronts were going up every week. There was a pride here, a rugged, distinctively American arrogance that said, we can conquer this land, we can tame the soil, we can build a civilization where there was once only buffalo grass and wind. Families were pouring in by the trainload. The Frisco Railroad line ran right through the heart of town, the iron artery that kept the blood of commerce flowing. You had the Culbertson family, prominent, respected. You had the Hibbard family. You had school teachers, blacksmiths, grocers, cotton gin operators. They were building frame houses, wooden structures, beautiful, but fragile. They were building brick business blocks, thinking they were solid, thinking they were permanent, but they had made a critical mistake, a mistake based on ignorance. They had built their dream town in the center of a geographic bowling alley. We didn't call it Tornado Alley back then. We didn't have a name for it. We just knew that in the spring, the wind had a temper. You'd see the devils dancing out on the plains, little dust whirls. You'd laugh at 'em, we thought. If you built a strong house, and you went to church, the good Lord would keep the roof on. That was the mindset, the cyclone mindset. See, back then, the word tornado was considered bad for business. Newspapers were actually discouraged from using it. They didn't want to scare away investors from the East Coast. They didn't want to spook the settlers, so they downplayed the wind. They called them windstorms, or gales. It was a conspiracy of silence, fueled by money. And Snyder? Snyder sat right on the dry line. Now, for those of you who aren't weather nerds, the dry line is the invisible battlefield of the southern plains. It is where the dry, cool air tumbling down from the Rocky Mountains crashes headfirst into the hot, sticky, moisture-rich air flowing up from the Gulf of Mexico. When those two armies meet, they don't mix. They clash. They explode. And Kiowa County, where Snyder sat exposed on the flat prairie, was ground zero for this collision. It was a geographic kill box, and 3,000 people were living inside it. Let's pause the timeline for a second. We are at May 8th, 2 days before the event. I want you to look at the technology these people had to protect themselves. Imagine a world with zero electronic eyes. Today, If a supercell forms over the Texas Panhandle, a Doppler radar station in Norman, Oklahoma, sees it instantly. We see the rotation. We see the hook echo. We see the debris ball, which is the radar signature of houses being chewed up and spat out. We know. In 1905, the warning system was a telegraph operator tapping out a message in Morse code. Asterisk, click. Click, 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 asterisk. That was it. And that message only traveled if the lines were up. If the storm hadn't already blown the poles down 5 miles up the track, you were deaf. The U.S. Weather Bureau, the grandfather of the National Weather Service, did issue forecasts. But they were broad, vague. They would say things like, conditions are favorable for local storms. Local storms. It's the equivalent of telling a soldier, there might be a loud noise today. They didn't understand the physics of the supercell. They didn't know what a rear flank downdraft was. They believed, mistakenly, that tornadoes were caused by electricity or vacuum suction alone. So, when the people of Snyder looked up at the sky, they were looking with 19th century eyes at a 20th century monster. Okay, back to the timeline. May 10th, 1905. Wednesday. The morning starts wrong. Residents in Snyder wake up, and the air feels heavy, not just humid, heavy. Survivors would later describe it as sticky, a wet wool blanket that you couldn't shake off. I remember the laundry wouldn't dry. I hung the sheets out at 8 in the morning, and by noon, they were still damp, limp, just hanging there. There was no breeze. The leaves on the cottonwoods were dead still. It was hot, but not a sun hot. It was a suffocating hot, like the air was waiting for something. That sticky feeling, that's the dew point. When the dew point hits 60 degrees, it feels humid. When it hits 70, it feels tropical. On May 10th in Snyder, the dew point was likely climbing past 75. The atmosphere was saturated with fuel, gasoline vapor just floating in the air, waiting for a match. To the south, near the Red River border with Texas, the pressure was falling, rapidly. A low-pressure system was deepening, spinning counterclockwise, dragging that Gulf moisture deeper and deeper into the trap. At 4 p.m., the sky began to change. It wasn't dark yet, but the light turned, brassy, a sickly yellow filter over the world, and then the birds stopped. This is a cliché in disaster movies, right? The animals know, but in 1905 accounts, this is mentioned over and over again. The total, absolute cessation of nature's background noise. No crickets, no meadowlarks, just the heat and the silence. Let's move to the train station, the heartbeat of the town. The station agent is busy. He's got telegraphs coming in about freight loads, grain prices, passenger lists. But then, a message comes through from the southwest, from a town called Odell, asterisk, click, 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 asterisk. The message is fragmented. It mentions a storm, a bad one, hail the size of hen's eggs. The station agent probably frowned. Hail is bad for the crops. He might have looked out the window, checking for green clouds. But he didn't ring a bell. He didn't run into the street screaming. Because hail happens. Thunderstorms happen. He didn't know that 20 miles away. The atmosphere had just broken. A massive, rotating updraft, a mesocyclone had initiated. It was miles wide, and it was hungry. At 6 p.m., families are sitting down to dinner. Imagine the Culbertson family. The father, G. W. Culbertson, a man of standing. He's at the table. Maybe they're having roast beef, maybe corn. The windows are open to catch a breeze that isn't there. They are talking about the future, about the school year ending, about the crops. They are completely unaware that in 2 hours they will be fighting for their lives. This is the horror of the pre-radar era. The threat is not a red blob on a TV screen. The threat is a physical object moving across the land, and you cannot see it until it is on top of you. We saw the lightning first. It wasn't striking down, like normal lightning. It was inside the clouds, flickering, constant, like a strobe light. The clouds to the southwest were piling up, higher and higher. Towers of black cotton, and they were moving fast. Too fast. 7 p.m. Sunset. This is the danger zone. Usually, tornadoes lose power when the sun goes down. The heat of the day dissipates, the energy fades, and the storms collapse. But not this one. This system was feeding on a low-level jet stream, a river of fast-moving air just a few thousand feet off the ground that kicks in after dark. Instead of dying, the storm was getting stronger. It was evolving. To the southwest, near the Texas border, the clouds began to lower. A wall cloud formed a pedestal of terror, dropping from the base of the supercell. And from that wall cloud, a finger descended. It wasn't the thin, rope-like tornadoes you see in Twister. This was a wedge, a block of grinding wind that widened and widened until it was wider than it was tall. It touched the earth, and the earth screamed. We are now at 7:30 p.m. The telegraph lines begin to chatter with panic. Message from the town of Olusti. Asterisk, bad storm, heavy damage. Asterisk, message from El Dorado. Asterisk, cyclone sighted. Heading northeast. Asterisk, heading northeast. Draw a line on the map. Start at El Dorado. Draw a line northeast. It points directly at Snyder. But who tells the town? There is no siren. There is no PA system. Word of mouth begins to spread. But it's slow. A neighbor tells a neighbor, sky looks bad. Better get in the cellar. But many people in Snyder didn't have storm cellars. They had root cellars, maybe. Or they just had their homes. Their wooden frame homes. And remember the psychology. It's 1905. It's dark. You're tired. You've worked a 12-hour day in the fields. The rain starts to fall. The natural instinct when it rains is to go times inside asterisk, to seek shelter times in times your house. But in a tornado, your house is not a shelter. Your house is a weapon. The walls that protect you from the cold become the shrapnel that kills you. By going inside, the people of Snyder were stepping into the coffin. 7:45 p.m. The wind in Snyder picks up. It's not the storm yet. It's the inflow. The beast is inhaling. The supercell is now sucking air into itself from miles around. Trees in Snyder start to bend, pointing times toward times the storm. Leaves are ripped off branches and sucked into the vacuum. The pressure drops so fast that people's ears pop. And then, the sound. It started as a rumble, low, like a freight train on a trestle bridge, but it didn't pass. It got louder and deeper. It shook the floorboards. My husband stood up from his chair. He looked pale. He said, "That isn't a train. The 7:45 isn't due for 10 minutes. He walked to the door and opened it. What he saw would have frozen the blood in his veins. To the southwest, illuminated by the constant, strobing flashes of blue-green lightning, was a wall. Not a funnel, a wall. It was blacker than the night. It took up the entire horizon, and it was boiling. Debris was already lofted into the air, thousands of feet high. The remains of barns, fences, livestock, swirling in a macabre dance around the core. It was moving at 40 miles per hour. It was closing the distance. The time for evacuation was gone. The time for preparation was gone. There was only time for one thing. 7:55 p.m. The telegraph operator in Snyder reaches for his key. He hears the roar. He feels the building shaking. The windows are rattling so hard they threaten to shatter. He tries to send one last message, a warning to the next town down the line. Asterisk, click, click, asterisk. The line goes dead. The wire has been snapped. Snyder is now cut off from the world. The lights in the town flicker and die. Total darkness. The only light comes from the lightning, revealing the monster stepping over the city limits. It is here. The roar becomes deafening. It's not a sound anymore. It's a physical pressure. It's the sound of a million trees snapping at once. In the Culbertson house, the father grabs his children. In the hotel, the guests run for the interior hallway. In the pool hall, the men dive under the heavy slate tables. And then, the front door of the general store explodes inward. The clock strikes 8 p.m., and the world ends. 8:01 p.m. There is a misconception about tornadoes. People think it's just wind. They think it's air moving fast. But at 8:01 p.m. in Snyder, the air stopped being air. It became a solid object. When wind speeds cross 200 miles per hour, the atmosphere behaves like a fluid. It behaves like water. It hits you with the weight of a tidal wave. The tornado entered the southwest corner of the town, and it didn't just knock buildings down. It disintegrated them. The first structures to go were the small frame houses on the edge of the settlement. They didn't collapse. They exploded. The pressure drop inside the funnel was so severe, so instant, that the air inside the homes expanded violently outward. Walls blew out, roofs lifted like bottle caps, and then the debris field arrived. Imagine a blender. Now imagine that blender is a mile wide, and inside that blender are 2x4s, bricks, cast iron, stoves, wagons, and trees. That is what hit the residential district. It wasn't dark anymore. That was the strangest thing. The lightning was so constant, so bright, that you could see everything in flashes. Blue, white, blue, white. I saw my neighbor's house simply vanish. 1 second it was there. The next flash, just a foundation, a bare slab, and the sound. God, the sound. It was like the sky was screaming. The roar is now at 110 decibels. It is loud enough to cause permanent hearing damage instantly. The tornado moved into the business district. This is where the problematic F5 designation comes from. Physics tells us that a brick building should offer some protection, but the Snyder storm ignored physics. It hit the brick storefronts on Main Street. The wind drove straws of hay, flexible, dry hay, straight through telephone poles. It took pine boards and drove them through solid iron boilers. It stripped the feathers off of chickens, not blew the chickens away. It times plucked them alive due to the sheer frictional stress of the wind. This is the violence of the vortex. The storm tore through the dim flicker of the lamps and plunged the town into a chaos of flying masonry. The large, sturdy brick buildings, they crumbled like sand castles. The debris was now acting as a scourge. It was sandblasting everything in its path. People who were caught outside didn't just suffer impact trauma. They were stripped. The wind was so ferocious it tore the clothes off their bodies. Shoes, coats, layers of cotton, ripped away in milliseconds, leaving the victims exposed to the flying glass and timber. We need to talk about the Culbertson family. I mentioned them in Act 1. G. W. Culbertson, a man who thought he had built a life. His home was directly in the path. When the roar started, they didn't have a storm cellar. They did what thousands of people have done since. They huddled together, G. W., his wife, and their children. They likely went to the center of the house, maybe under a table, maybe in a doorway. But the house they were in was about to become part of the atmosphere. When the vortex hit the Culbertson home, it didn't just destroy the structure, it scattered it. The force was so extreme that pieces of the Culbertson home would later be found 60 miles away. 60 miles. Inside that house, chaos reigned. The roof tore free, the walls dissolved, and the family was lifted. We often talk about survivors, but in the core of an F5, survival is not a matter of skill, it is a matter of luck, a game of inches. G. W. Culbertson was thrown, his wife was thrown. The children were scattered into the dark, screaming void. One daughter, barely a teenager, was launched through the air. She landed hundreds of yards away in a muddy field. She survived, but her father? They found G. W. Culbertson later. He hadn't just been killed. The violence done to his body is difficult to describe. The storm didn't just take his life. It erased his humanity. This scene played out in dozens of homes simultaneously. The Hibbard family, the McCartys, the Smiths, whole bloodlines, ended in the span of 45 seconds. I was holding my baby. I was holding him so tight. I thought, if I just hold him, he'll be safe. The wind took the roof off. And then I felt a pulling. A terrible, sucking pulling. It tried to take him out of my arms. I screamed. I bit down on his blanket. I held on until my fingers bled, and then the wall fell on us. 8:07 p.m. The tornado is now crossing the railroad tracks. It hits the freight depot. There were massive locomotives on the tracks, engines weighing nearly 100 tons, iron giants. The tornado pushed them over. It rolled them like toys. The steel rails spiked into the ground with heavy iron ties. They were ripped up, twisted, tied into knots. Think about the force required to bend a steel railroad rail into a corkscrew. It requires heat. It requires hydraulic presses. The wind did it. The oil tanks near the depot ruptured. Thousands of gallons of kerosene and oil spilled out, instantly vaporizing into the high wind stream. And then, a spark. Maybe a lantern, maybe a snapped power line. Fire. In the middle of the rain, in the middle of the wind, the wreckage caught fire. So, now, you have a tornado that is also burning. Survivors described seeing balls of fire rolling down the streets. These were tumbleweeds of debris, soaked in oil, lit on fire, and bowled through the town at 100 miles an hour. It was hell. Literal, biblical hell. The smell changed. It wasn't just ozone anymore. It smelled of sulfur, of crushed pine, of wet plaster, and, unmistakably, the copper smell of blood. The main hotel in town was a brick structure, solid. Dozens had fled there. Thinking the brick would save them, they were huddled in the lobby, praying. When the storm hit the hotel, the top floor sheared off first, then the second floor. The people on the ground floor looked up and saw the lightning. The roof was gone. Then the walls collapsed inward. But, miraculously, the floor held. People were buried, trapped under beams, covered in lime dust and broken glass. But many in the hotel survived because the walls fell times out asterisk or formed a lean-to shelter over them. But the noise. You couldn't hear a person scream if they were 2 inches from your ear. It was a roar that vibrated your chest. You felt it in your teeth. And the pressure. My ears popped so hard, I thought I was deaf. It felt like my head was being squeezed in a vice. And then, as quickly as it had arrived, the roar began to shift. It didn't stop. It just moved. The tornado tore through the northeast side of town, chewing up the remaining shanties, and headed back out onto the open prairie. It left behind a swath of destruction that was a mile wide and 2 miles long. Every single thing in that zone was gone. The storm continued its march northeast towards the Wichita Mountains, hungry for more. But in Snyder, the wind died down. The rain kept falling. A cold, hard rain now. And then came the most terrifying moment of all. 8:15 p.m. The freight train roar fades into the distance. The wind drops from 300 miles per hour to 30, then to 10, then to a breeze. Total, absolute silence. No crickets, no birds, no town clock, just the sound of rain hitting the mud. Asterisk, pat, 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 asterisk. And then the first sound of life, a moan. Then a scream, then a chorus. From beneath the piles of lumber, from the flooded basements, from the fields where bodies had been tossed like rag dolls. The town of Snyder began to wake up to its nightmare. It was pitch black. The power plant was gone. The gas lines were hissing. Broken snakes in the dark. Those who could walk crawled out of holes. They stood up. They wiped the mud from their eyes. They looked for their neighbors' houses, and they saw nothing. Just a flat, empty plain, lit by the flickering fires of the burning oil tanks. I stood up. I called for my husband. I called for my sister. I looked down the street. I knew where the church was supposed to be. I knew where the school was, but I couldn't find them. I thought I was lost. I thought I had been blown to a different town. But then I saw the sign for the drugstore, lying in the mud at my feet. And I knew. I wasn't lost. The town was gone. The iron skeleton had been born. Snyder, the Boomtown, the pride of the territory, had been reduced to splinters in 15 minutes. But the horror wasn't over, because now they had to find the bodies. And, in the dark, with only lightning to guide them, they realized that the dead were everywhere, 8:20 p.m. May 10th, 1905. The storm has moved on. It is currently tearing up the Wichita Mountains to the northeast, killing livestock and flattening barns. But in Snyder, the event is over. And now, the real horror begins. We need to sit in this moment for a minute. Imagine the sensory deprivation. It is pitch black. There is no moon. The heavy cloud deck is still choking out the stars. The only light comes from the distant lightning of the departing storm, and the flickering, orange glow of the fires starting near the train depot. The rain is cold. It mixes with the pulverized plaster, the soil, and the blood to create a thick, glue-like mud that coats everything. Survivors are waking up in this mud. They are concussed. They are in shock. Many have ruptured eardrums from the pressure drop. They are walking through a landscape that is alien to them. Landmarks are gone. Street signs are gone. Even the trees' massive, 100-year-old cottonwoods have been snapped off at the base or ripped out by the roots. The town of Snyder has been converted into what newspapers the next day would call the Iron Skeleton. Why that name? Because the wood was gone. The bricks were gone. The only things left standing were the heavy iron machinery, the twisted safe from the bank, the printing press from the newspaper office, and the iron frames of the school desks, standing like tombstones in the dark. We couldn't tell who was who. Everyone was covered in that gray mud. You'd walk up to a man, grab his shoulder, wipe the mud off his face just to see if it was your brother, and the silence. It didn't last long. Soon, the moaning started. It came from everywhere, from under the piles of lumber, from the basements filled with water. It was a low, constant sound, like the earth itself was in pain. The first responders were not doctors. They were survivors. Men with broken arms dug through the rubble with their one good hand. Women tore their dresses into strips to bind wounds. But the biggest problem was the dark. You cannot find a child buried under a collapsed wall in the pitch black. So, they improvised. They found lanterns in the debris. They siphoned oil from the ruptured tanks, risking an explosion to fuel torches. Slowly, tiny pinpricks of yellow light began to appear in the blackness, bobbing up and down, weaving through the wreckage. Is anyone there? Help me. Over here. But for many, the lights came too late. The wreckage was unstable. Walls that were half-standing collapsed on rescuers. Piles of debris shifted, crushing those trapped underneath. And then there were the gas leaks. The smell of escaping gas mixed with the smoke, creating a toxic, flammable fog over the ruins. It was a scene from Dante's Inferno. While Snyder was bleeding in the dark, the outside world was just waking up to the news. Remember the telegraph lines? Most were down. But one line, a single, fragile copper wire running to the town of Lawton, remained active for a few minutes longer than the others, or perhaps a writer made it out. The records are conflicting, but at roughly 9 p.m., the telegraph office in Lawton received the signal, *Snyder destroyed. Send help. Send doctors. Send coffins. *Send coffins. That was the metric of the disaster. The superintendent of the Frisco Railroad didn't hesitate. He ordered a special train to be assembled immediately. This was a mercy mission. They cleared the tracks. They loaded the train with every doctor and nurse they could find in Lawton. They loaded crates of bandages, whiskey for anesthesia, and lumber. At 10 p.m., the special train steamed out of Lawton. Imagine the atmosphere on that train. The doctors are sitting in the passenger cars. They are smoking cigarettes. Some are playing cards to pass the time. They are nervous. They've heard rumors of a bad storm, but they are thinking, how bad can it be? A few broken legs? A few roofs off? They had no concept of an F5. The train raced through the night, the headlight cutting through the rain. As they got closer to Snyder, they had to slow down. Why? Because there was debris on the tracks, not branches. Houses. Parts of roofs. Furniture. Dead cattle. The train crawled the last few miles. The doctors looked out the windows. They saw the debris field in the lightning flashes, and the card games stopped. The cigarettes were put out. They realized they weren't rolling into a rescue mission. They were rolling into a war zone. The train pulled into what was left of the Snyder depot at 11:30 p.m. The doctors stepped off the train, and stepped into the mud. They were immediately swarmed, not by patients, but by people begging for help to dig. My wife is under there. My boy is trapped. The depot, or what was left of it, became the triage center. They used the train car doors as operating tables. There was no sterile environment. There was no anesthesia beyond morphine and whiskey. Amputations were performed by lantern light, in the mud, with the rain still falling, and the pile of bodies grew. By dawn on May 11th, the sun rose on a landscape that looked like the surface of the moon. The iron skeleton was revealed in all its grim glory, and the counting began. They didn't have a morgue big enough, so they used the brick schoolhouse, one of the few buildings partially standing and local businesses in nearby towns. The bodies were laid out in rows. Men, women, children. They were covered in sheets, or tarps, or just coats. Identifying them was a nightmare. Remember, the violence of the wind. It stripped clothing. It stripped features. The mud was impacted into the skin so deeply that you had to wash the faces with sponges just to see who they were. I went to the schoolhouse to find my uncle. There were rows of them. It was so quiet in there, just the sound of boots on the floor. I walked down the line. I looked at the hands. I knew my uncle's hands. He had a scar on his thumb. I looked at 50 pairs of hands before I found him. He looked peaceful. But the man next to him, he didn't have a face anymore. The official death toll is a subject of debate even today. The official count is usually cited as 97, but look at the newspapers from May 12th and 13th. They list unknown. They list missing. Many of the victims were transient workers, men who had come for the harvest, men who didn't have families in Snyder to look for them. If a transient worker is blown into a creek 5 miles away and buried in mud, and no one reports him missing, does he make the list? Historians believe the true death toll is likely over 120, and the injuries? Over 150 serious injuries. In a town of 3,000, that means 1 inch every 10 people was a casualty. Let that sink in. Imagine if 10% of your town was wiped out in 15 minutes. The Culbertson family, whom we followed earlier, was decimated. G. W. Culbertson was found. His wife was found. Several children were found. They were buried in the Snyder Cemetery. If you go there today, you will see the dates. The 10th of May, 1905. The 10th of May, 1905. The 10th of May, 1905. Row after row of the same date. Whole families sharing a single headstone because there was no money left for individual markers. Now, we need to shift gears. We need to put on our investigator hats. Because the Snyder tornado is not just a tragedy, it is a scientific anomaly. In 1971, Dr. Tetsuya Fujita created the F-scale. It rates tornadoes from F0 to F5 based on times damage asterisk. Snyder happened 66 years before the scale existed. But modern meteorologists, looking at the photographs and the written records, have retroactively classified Snyder as an F5, the finger of God. But why? What did this storm do that an F4 couldn't do? Let's look at the forensic evidence. Exhibit A, the grand piano. Remember the hook? The piano found 40 miles away. For a wind vortex to lift a 1,000-pound object, keep it suspended in the updraft, and transport it 40 miles without smashing it to smithereens instantly, requires a sustained updraft velocity that is almost mathematically impossible. It suggests the storm had a multi-vortex structure smaller, intense suction spots rotating inside the main funnel. Exhibit B, the debarking. In the photos of the aftermath, you see tree stumps, but look closer, they don't have bark. The wind was so intense, and the debris, sand, dirt, gravel, was flying so fast that it acted like sandpaper. It stripped the bark off the hardwoods instantly. This only happens at wind speeds exceeding 200 miles per hour. Exhibit C, the ground scouring. Survivors reported that the grass was gone, not blown over. Asterisk, gone. Asterisk. The tornado acted like a vacuum cleaner on the soil. It scoured the earth down to the clay. Farmers reported that their wheat fields looked like they had been plowed by machinery. This is a hallmark of the most violent storms in history. Storms like Jarrell, Texas in 1997, or Phil Campbell, Alabama in 2011. Exhibit D, The missiles. A piece of straw driven into a telephone pole. A 2x4 plank driven through a steel boiler. This is kinetic energy. Formula. Kinetic energy equals 1/2 mass times velocity squared. If you double the speed of the wind, you don't double the energy. You quadruple it. At 300 miles per hour, a piece of wood becomes an armor-piercing round. The Snyder tornado wasn't just big, it was times-dense asterisk. It was likely a rain-wrapped wedge. This means the funnel was hidden behind a curtain of falling rain. This explains why so many people didn't see it until it was too late. They saw rain, they saw hail. They didn't see the monster until it was eating their porch. There is one final mystery about the physics of Snyder: the green sky. Witnesses swore the sky was green. Not gray, not black, green. For decades, this was dismissed as folklore, but now we know. The green tint comes from the sunlight interacting with the massive amount of water and hail inside the cloud. It's a prism effect. A deep, bruised green sky is nature's way of saying, there is a massive amount of ice suspended above your head. And, in Snyder, that ice came down as a hammer. So, what happened next? Did Snyder die? By all logic, it should have. The town was leveled. The economy was ruined. The trauma was universal. But the American West in 1905 was not a place that gave up. On May 12th, 2 days after the storm, whilst bodies were still being pulled from the rubble, the sound of hammers returned. They started rebuilding, but they built differently this time. They built cyclone cellars. Before 1905, storm cellars were rare. After Snyder, they became standard. Every family dug a hole. Every family reinforced a door. The Snyder disaster changed the psychology of the southern plains. It taught the settlers that the land was not their friend. The land was a host, and they were guests who needed to be careful. This disaster also pushed the U.S. Weather Bureau. The failure to warn Snyder, the breakdown of the telegraph lines, the total blindside. It embarrassed the government. It began the slow, painful march toward a better warning system. It would take decades. It would take the invention of radar in World War II. It would take the 1974 super outbreak. But the blood spilled in Snyder was the ink used to write the first chapters of modern severe weather safety. Today, Snyder is a quiet town. It's still there. If you drive through it, you'll see modern houses. You'll see a school. You'll see a grain elevator. But if you look closely at the older foundations, you might see chips in the concrete. You might see a tree that looks a little too twisted. And if you go to the cemetery, you will see the rows of 1,905. We like to think we have conquered nature. We have Doppler radar. We have satellites. We have sirens that can wake the dead. But the lesson of Snyder is not about technology. It's about humility. On that humid night in May, a perfect machine formed in the sky. It followed the laws of thermodynamics perfectly. It didn't hate the town. It didn't want to kill the Culbertson family. It just was. It was a reminder that we live on a volatile planet, that the atmosphere is a living, breathing ocean of gas that can turn violent in a heartbeat. The people of Snyder didn't have a warning. They didn't have a chance, but they had each other. And when the sun rose on the iron skeleton, they didn't leave. They picked up the bricks, they wiped off the mud, and they started again. Because that is what humans do. We build castles in the sand, and when the tide comes in, we build them again. This is the story of the Snyder tornado. Stay safe, keep your eye on the sky, and I'll see you in the next one.